All right. Welcome, folks. Thanks for joining us here today. As people are starting to join into the webinar, I want to again thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about hazard mitigation analysis and energy storage installations. And this is a topic that we've been seeing a lot more of. And so I have a couple of great guests joining me today, kind of going through HMAs is the acronym that we're going to be using a lot. So hazard mitigation analysis, something that's required as part of International Fire Code and also NFPA 855. We'll talk a lot more about that. So as we get going here, as always, this is our intention here. Our hope is to be interactive. So if you have questions, comments that you want to throw out there, the Q&A function is the way to get those to us. We will be able to see those questions come in and be able to address those as we're going along. Definitely want to see those, don't hold back. We're, gonna have a conversation here and generally run to the very top of the hour. So if you have a question, throw it out there. I'll hold on to it if I know we're going to talk about it later, but nonetheless, we'd like to get some questions. We did get some pre-submitted questions as well, so I've put those into the notes. I'm going to try and pull those in to kind of help with as we're going along there. So that's kind of the run of that. So let's go ahead and get through some introductions, and then we'll get into the topic at hand. So my name is Ryan Mayfield, founder of Mayfield Renewables, and this is the Ask Mayfield Anything series, something that I enjoy doing, talking with really smart folks at different parts of the industry to be able to talk about some of the key things that are happening within the solar and energy storage industries in order to kind of pass that information along and kind of making the industry as a whole better as we're going along and doing these things. Mayfield Renewables as a whole, we are a consulting engineering firm. And so we are doing a lot of project engineering. We're doing a lot on solar systems and solar and energy storage systems. So we do project engineering all the way from feasibility studies through commissioning support and help, and with plan sets and everything in between. So that's definitely something that we're heavily involved in on the energy storage side. And then the other thing that where I spend a lot of my time is on the education and training. So doing a lot of different types of classes. We have online classes available. We do engagements around the country, shows for individual companies. And so if there's some education and training aspects of some things that you or your company might need, happy to talk about that as well. So today I have a couple of guests with me, and we're going to kind of get into the HMA part of this. So first off, Nick Bartlett, fire protection engineer at Atar Fire. Nick, I believe we met a few years ago now at the PNNL conference. But would you take a moment, just kind of introduce yourself, your business, and kind of where you're sitting at and how you're involved in the energy storage industry?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me today to the webinar. Yeah, my name's Nick Bartlett. I'm the founder of Atar Fire. Started Atar Fire about 3 years ago. I've been a fire protection engineer for about 20 years now. I've worked for UL, testing and certifying fire suppression products. Worked for Jensen Hughes as a consultant. Spent about a little over a decade as an AHJ. And I've been involved in the last 4 years as a technical committee member of NFPA 855. So I've been teaching NFPA 855 for a few years now, doing HMAs. And I think what we're going to talk about today, you're really going to see an evolution of where this HMA has come from and where it's going. So thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, we've been talking a lot recently, so I appreciate all that. We also have Matt Salmon from City of San Diego, and so fire captain, supervising deputy fire marshal. And so Matt, being in San Diego, San Diego is one of those jurisdictions that is, I would say, on the leading edge of, as a jurisdiction, knowing kind of what's going on with energy storage systems. Some of it has been kind of maybe forced upon you with some incidents and things like that, but would love to kind of hear your background and kind of what you're seeing with energy storage in the lens that you have from the fire service.
Sure. Before I get into that, I'd like to thank Mr. Mayfield and Mr. Bartlett for having me on today. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate having the chance to be able to come talk to industry. My background, I was on the fire department on like a fire engine for the last 18 years. I am a fire captain. As part of that, I've been on our hazmat team. I'm a hazardous materials specialist, and our hazmat team responds all over the county. So I worked there for a number of years as a captain, and now I'm upstairs as a supervising deputy fire marshal. And basically, I kind of bridge the gap between our operations, the enforcement of the California Fire Code, and working with the building department. We call Development Services Division, DSD here. And a large part of that was kind of spurred by the rise of battery energy storage systems, lithium ion batteries, and all of that we hope to get into more here today on this webinar.
Perfect. Thanks. That's very helpful, and it's great to have, the fire official. That term gets used a lot within 855, and so being able to have somebody to talk with, with that experience is great. So I really appreciate you joining and spending some time with us to go through all this today. So let's go ahead and jump into the topic. And so, role of hazard mitigation analysis in energy storage installations. So hazard mitigation analysis, we'll spend a lot of time. It's probably something that folks have seen. If you've gone through 855, if you've gone through IFC, there's some references to these HMAs, and I think part of this is it's something that it's in there, and the question is, how do we go about it? How do we do this? What is it that we're supposed to have? I think it's a thing that's still being learned in the industry, quite honestly. So we're going to start off with some very, high level questions, quite honestly. But, first off, what is an HMA, hazard mitigation analysis? Nick, I'm going to throw that one at you first, since as a fire protection engineer, we'll talk more about this. But I mean, a fire protection engineer is going to be who ultimately, creates this HMA. So can you give us kind of that high level of what it is, what we're going to see in an HMA?
Yeah, so I mean, at the very highest level, the HMA, it's a document, first of all, and it's an evaluation, and it's looking at the potential failure modes in an energy storage system. So, what are the different ways that a failure can occur? And then it goes and looks at what are the ways where we can actually prevent that failure from happening. And then, if a failure does occur, what measures do we have in place to reduce the consequences of that failure? So that's what an HMA is at the highest level. Ultimately, you do go into different potential failure modes. You will get into the design of the product. And what's really important takeaway for today, I think, is that there is an analysis of the product, and then there's also analysis of where the product is located. And only when you consider the two together can you do a full evaluation of not just code compliance, but also the totality of the potential hazard of any installation.
When you say the analysis of the product, are you talking about like the 95 for the listing of the product, or are you talking about something even beyond that, when you're analyzing the product? Is it in this view, this lens of the HMA that you're talking about?
Yeah, so it's actually much more thorough than just a check if the product is listed. So a good HMA will dive into all the various characteristics of a product, of a battery energy storage system. For example, the cooling systems, the HVAC, the mechanical systems, of course, the explosion control systems, all the different safety systems, the battery management systems. A good HMA will look at all of these. Of course, it will look at certifications and it will combine that all together to assess for the product, if there's enough checks and balances there, if everything's been designed properly, if we have enough measure, again, for the product itself. So it's really a layered approach. Certifications and listings are just one part of that.
Okay. And then I guess a little bit more, on, I guess one of the questions I would have is, so we have the HMAs, 855 is a relatively young document. Is that when we first started seeing these being required, or is this something that goes back even further for other technologies? Is this something that we've had previously for fire officials?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So, an HMA is just it could be considered an FMEA. There's other names for this type of document. PHA, in process hazard analysis is probably a little bit more uh, in depth, but in other industries, in other fire protection areas, there are similar documents where you will be looking at how can something fail? What are the mitigating measures? I mean, we've got hydrogen. It's very common in the hydrogen industry to do something similar. So it's not unique to just batteries, and it has been in an NFPA 855 since the first iteration, because these are highly complex installations with many layers of failure, and they need to be properly designed. So you need somebody to look at all that holistically.
And then, so who, I guess the stakeholders that are going to be involved. So a fire protection engineer is going to be who writes the HMA. Um, and so I guess as a fire protection engineer, who are you pulling into, are you interviewing people, or how are you getting the information you need and getting that information in a way that makes sure that gets to the right people?
Yeah, so typically I would say the main parties would be either an EPC or a developer, somebody that's in charge with, a project pulling permits, and then the manufacturer, right? So there you have again, your product, and then you have the site installation. And of course, you need to be interfacing with the AHJ along the way. So those are the primary stakeholders. So, with the manufacturer, you'll be getting all sorts of information about the specific design of the product. From the EPC or the developer, you'll be getting project drawings. Where is this located? What are the distances to exposures? Things like that. And then all of that gets wrapped up in the permit package. And along the way, sometimes even as early on as possible in the process, it's actually good to engage the AHJ if there's any questions about where this is located. Can it go here? Can it not go here? Regardless of what the code may say. So those are really the main stakeholders, I would say.
And Matt, we're going to talk more about this in the next slide as well, but I just kind of want a little precursor, if you will, just in terms of, as an HMA, or seeing these HMAs. I think this is one of the things, we talked about. It's not necessarily a document that, you're going to take and read and evaluate. What is it that, you want the fire protection engineers to know, that what you're looking for, kind of what's the information that would be key for you to be pulling out of these in order to make doing the emergency response plans, for example, being able to establish those.
Sure. So as I said, kind of in the opening, the way my AHJ works, the city of San Diego, is I work with the FPEs over at the building department, what we call DSD. And one of the main ways that I get involved is kind of in two ways. One, at the very beginning, when we're going to say we're going to require an HMA, there's very clear language in 1207, and 1207 references 104 in the California Fire Code that basically stipulates that an HMA has to be prepared by someone who is qualified to do it. So that generally always means an FPE. And sometimes we get in a back and forth with the applicant on like who we're going to allow to have them do an HMA. So there are times, that's generally a lot of times where I would get involved, is don't be surprised if we ask like, hey, we want to have this person do it. Okay, I need their qualifications, or I need their firm, because I'm going to research them to make sure that they are a reputable firm. They are capable of providing this. And then as we'll get into later, really, I'm looking for them to then use this HMA to inform creating a viable emergency response plan, commissioning, decommissioning plan, and providing training to their employees. And then lastly, this HMA kind of hit on it, where it's like, hey, are we going to allow this BESS in a given location, given other occupancies around it?
Perfect. Yeah. And like I said, we're going to touch on some of those other things a little bit deeper here. But thanks for that kind of that perspective and just, when, or yeah, the requirements around those. There were a couple questions that came in beforehand, and I see Joel sent a question in. Joel actually submitted one as well. So the question that Joel asked beforehand was, are you more commonly seeing developer or the EPC own the HMA? And I think Nick, you touched on that a little bit, but from what I've seen, and I'd love to get your guys' perspective as well, but is pretty much whoever's running that permit process, whoever's owning that aspect of it would be the one who's going to own the HMA. But that's going to be part of the permitting process. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that, or if you've seen anything different or corroborate that.
No, I would echo that sentiment. If you don't mind, I did want to go back to what
Yeah,
Matt just said.
sure.
Who should be doing these HMAs? And Matt mentioned that maybe in some instances they'll want to make sure that who's ever doing the HMA that they feel comfortable with. So I think it's important to stress that you need a competent person to be doing these HMAs. Like just like any other industry within fire protection, batteries are a niche, right? And so not every fire protection engineer is an expert in battery energy storage systems. And sometimes, an EPC will come to me because they had either done an in-house HMA or they had a company do an HMA and it was like 2 pages long and the AHJ rejected it. So this is where it's important for the AHJ because they want to see somebody that's competent, that knows what they're talking about. And it's also a benefit to who's ever running the project to use somebody that's competent because you don't want to get into a position where you're so far along in a project, you've done this 2 or 3 page HMA of somebody who just they used AI or maybe they didn't know exactly what they were doing. They submit it to the AHJ and the AHJ says, nope, this isn't good enough. And then you have a whole bunch of rework. So it is a very important point to emphasize, I believe.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and actually a question came up and I was thinking something similar. So Jonathan asked the question, Matt, does San Diego keep a use use air quotes here, pre-approved list of FPEs, or is it you present the FPE to us and we'll do that analysis?
You would present the FPE to
Okay.
us. I would say we have people that we regularly do business with. And I would say if it's one thing that I could say, it does not hurt to have a relationship with your AHJ that we know you, you know us, and you know, if Nick Bartlett's name came across my desk, I don't have to like spend time trying to research that or something. So
Sure. And I guess it gets into a little tricky situation of if you have a pre-approved list, that might seem like an endorsement or something like that. So
exactly.
it's probably a little bit
Exactly.
of a catch-22 there. You definitely have people but you can't necessarily say go use this person or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. But again, if you approach us with someone that we know, it's
it's
much
going to be a little easier. Daniel Pastoyan asked a question as well on when he registered, asking about how common it's for jurisdictions to require site-specific HMAs. I think we'll dive more into that, but I put that question in here at this slide, just kind of in the beginning, to kind of help set this up. So I guess that's a question I would throw out to both of you. Nick, maybe you have a kind of a broader view of other AHJs out there. Matt, you're going to have probably, you're going to be, I know you talk to other AHJs, so it's not like you're only San Diego specific, but I'm just curious on what you're seeing in terms of that becoming required for energy storage systems.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between what the code requires and then what an AHJ might be requiring. So the 2023 NFPA 855, generally, if you're over 600 kilowatt hours, you need an HMA. There's an option for the AHJ to also just require one. And then moving to the 2026 NFPA 855, if you're over 20 kilowatt hours, you need an HMA. However, in practice, I mean, I find it to be dependent upon the particular jurisdiction, right? Some aren't requiring permits for energy storage systems. Some, they might not know everything we're going to be talking about today. So each jurisdiction, regardless of what the code does say, they might enforce something different, which is not to say, we always recommend you do what's in accordance with the code and what's the right thing. But not all AHJs may be aware that an HMA is a required document for a project.
Sure. I can speak to you for the city of San Diego uh, with the new code in 1207. An HMA is specifically called for anytime you're going to exceed your MAQ, anytime you're going to co-locate technologies, anytime you're going to use a novel technology. And now it adds, there's basically a catch-all. Basically it's anytime the AHJ requires it, and if we will be requiring it going forward. Again, it was becoming increasingly common, and now it will be required.
Yeah. And so yeah, so there's that fourth option in the 1207 now saying basically when the AHJ like you were saying, there's some very specific times it's required, and then there's this if the AHJ requests it, it can be a requirement. So um definitely something we're seeing more and more of as energy storage systems become more prevalent. I think it's one of those as the industry's growing, it's becoming like understood what the different aspects of the code and the requirements are. So
The
it's that's something that I feel like is we're seeing more of.
in previous large projects, we had required them using like broad language in Title 19, or required it under like 104, kind of
Got it.
using some of those languages to require it. Now it is specifically required in 1207.
Perfect. Well, we haven't asked this last question, so I want to kind of hit this one at least, and then we're going to move on. And as expected, there's lots to talk about and lots to say, so keeping us moving. But when should we be doing this? It seems it's if you get in there too early, it seems like you might have some rework that you have to do. But if you wait till it's too late, then doing any changes or design issues or anything like that might show up, but it's becomes a bigger pain. So I guess Nick, I'm presuming that this might be something more along the line since you're performing these. Like, kind of when do you get pulled into this, and when's an ideal time for you to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think this is something Matt and I both wanted to hit on. So, um, yeah, again, we talked earlier about there's a difference between like an HMA for a product and an HMA for a site. So, if you're an EPC or you're a developer, first of all, I would engage a fire protection engineer as early as you can, figure out if an HMA is required, and start with a product that has a product level HMA developed already. Um, Sometimes I get pulled into projects where, in fact, the AHJ has told the EPC they need to do an HMA, and that becomes an extreme. It can become a very problematic situation for everybody because if the product that was chosen doesn't comply with NFPA 855 or the California Fire Code, and there are some out there that maybe they don't have their listings, maybe they designed their explosion control system wrong, maybe there's just some issues with the design that does happen, then it's really difficult to write an HMA. And it's going to be really difficult for the AHJ to approve as well. So, in general, whether it's the manufacturer who is trying to source a product HMA, that can be done during R&D. I mean, I work with some manufacturers and they're like, we want to design this thing right. Let's start the HMA in the beginning so we outline all the requirements and design the product properly. And then on the other hand, with the EPCs and the developers, it's the same situation. Early is good because I have some developers, they say, hey, can you at least give me a list of products that you know comply with all the requirements. And then if they start with that list, we know that the path will be much easier for permitting. Like just the whole process is going to go easier. So, I mean, earlier is better regardless.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could echo everything that Nick just said, if I could echo everything that Nick just said to set yourself up for success. It it it's in your best interest, the AHJ's best interest. So yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome. And then Nick, you answered one of the questions. Can an ESS manufacturer provide an HMA report? So it sounds like a product specific, yes, but there's still going to be site specific issues. So you can take that as a starting point, and it sounds like you should be looking for manufacturers that have done that to probably make your life easier and just smooth that whole process. All right, let's keep moving into kind of these different perspectives. And so first off, Matt, going to pull you in and talk about fire service point of view here on HMAs. And as we've been talking about, as we've already said, written by, reviewed by fire protection engineers, which you are not a fire protection engineer, but you are the AHJ, and you need to be understanding, you know, the emergency response for this. And so that's, we have this list of things here that a HMA can be a parent document for, and one of them being an emergency response plan. I'd love to hear just kind of from the fire official's point of view, what that emergency response plan looks like. How does the HMA feed into that? And what is the information that you're looking for out of that in order to make sure that, if there is an incident, you as the fire official, the fire department know, kind of what you're going to be up against and what you need to do.
Sure. Thanks. This is it's a very broad question. So I'll start by saying, you said it exactly right. The HMA should inform these documents that are called for out of 1207. For my AHJ, we were kind of getting emergency response plans that were, 1 page or 100 pages. Same thing with the commissioning and decommissioning. We were kind of getting all over the place when we started our permitting for these a couple years ago. We have since standardized these documents. So if you were to apply for a BESS within the city of San Diego, you're going to get back like fillable PDFs that is your emergency response plan. It is your commissioning, your decommissioning. Your commissioning and decommissioning literally follows the points that are in 1207. And how do you get that information is you go back and reference your HMA. Your emergency response plan has very specific sections that call for how are you going to conduct training for your site personnel given the hazards identified in your HMA. That's one of the questions, and that's probably one of the most common places that we reject or ask for corrections is, hey, we're actually looking for specific answers based on your HMA in there, because what's important to us is that your personnel on the site of this BESS understand the hazards and have an idea of what to do if something went wrong based on your HMA. So, and then I know you asked me to get into a little bit, well, how would we use this for our operations personnel? We have our own standard operating procedures for how we would deal with a lithium ion battery incident, but we use it in two ways. One, for training for the crews in the immediate area is one of the things I would look in the HMA and looks for specific or unique hazards that I would make those crews aware of based on the HMA. And then a lot of times we would do site familiarity, just making sure that, like crews have a chance to walk through. They understand, hey, where's the emergency shut off for this? Where are the hydrants? The things of that nature. So does that answer the question enough there, Ryan?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess a follow-up on that would be that I'm curious. So, as the first responders,
Mhm.
is that something you're using the HMA, or you're using that information from the HMA and the emergency response plan to proactively like understand at this address there's an energy storage system, and kind of getting the crew that would be responsible, or at least the the chiefs in that. I'm not sure how exactly it's formulated, but the responsible parties for the first responders understanding here's where the disconnects are, here's what's on site. So it's not you're not rolling up on site and learning that there's a battery at that location.
Exactly. And in fact, we've gone so far as your emergency response plan. Like whenever an incident comes up, we have, you know, computers in the rigs like everybody else. Your incident comes up with all the notes and who's responding and what address. And in the lower right-hand corner will be that EPR that any responding captain can click on, in plain language, informed by the HMA. These are the unique hazards to this BESS, or this building has a BESS in it. Here's the emergency response plan for it.
Oh,
And then we
interesting.
also keep your commissioning and your decommissioning plan, because as part of that, ask you to identify in advance, hey, if you have a problem with this battery, who are you going to call for proper disposal, for example. Or if I need to get to your HMA, I can do that to be like, hey, we have a large incident here. What were some of the other hazards that were identified for the surrounding occupancies in the HMA?
Uh,
Excellent. So,
can I
yeah.
can I say one thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that there is a tie for sure between the emergency response plans and the HMA, and I think that aspect is not often caught. Let me give you an example. So, in a good HMA, you should be looking at large scale fire test data if it's available. We've seen in some large scale fire tests, there's been explosions. In some of them, there's been fire propagation between units maybe it's lasted 10 or 20 minutes and then it went out. We're getting information on how long the fire alarm systems last. That information is actually quite critical for responders. If they know that there's a potential for an explosion, that should be part of their training. And if they know that there's a potential for fire to propagate, they should know that because that could, adjust their tactics. So connecting those two actually is quite important. You can't always just have a boilerplate emergency response plan.
Yeah, that's great. And this is a good probably point or time to point out for folks in 855, there's some informative annexes at the backs of 855 that are quite useful. It's at least a starting point, if nothing else, on some of these items, emergency response plan being one of them. Definitely don't want to say, use that as gospel by any means, but it's interesting. The annexes in the back of 855 are longer than the code or the standard itself, but it's just a wealth of information. Highly recommend folks take a look at.
I would second that. When we were developing our, like this is your template to use for your emergency response plan, we referenced the annexes, the examples given in the back of 855.
Perfect. And somebody asked the question, Matt. You mentioned that you have that document. Is that on the public facing on the website on the public facing information, or is that something that somebody would have to request?
I just tried to talk with my mute on. I
No
was
worries.
that guy. You would have to request it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, there are, so for those out there in the audience, there are, again, in the annexes of 855, there are some good starting points for that, if nothing else, for that. Um, yeah, I don't want to, I guess we'll probably need to move on here a little bit, but you mentioned the commissioning plan, the decommissioning plan. Those are all things that are part of 855 as well, 1207. So these are things that as whoever's owning this aspect of it, whoever's running the permitting process, these are things that you need to have in place. And it's something I think for folks coming out of the solar industry specifically, and now adding storage into the mix, or others might not be so used to that. It's having a commissioning plan, a decommissioning plan, especially, isn't something that we're used to seeing. And so that's just something I want to kind of put out there for folks to make sure that they're aware of. Um, Going back real quick, I think we can answer this relatively quickly. That if you have manufacturers of multiple manufacturers that you're putting together for this equipment, Nick, you had mentioned the manufacturer specific HMA. that's really gonna fall on the battery, the energy storage side of it. I'm presuming that's who you'd be looking for to provide that information, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Most of the information pertaining to the ESS is going to be provided by the manufacturer. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, let's move into a little bit more on the fire protection engineer's point of view. Um, we probably talked a lot about this, but Nick, when you're putting these together, we talked about the site specific information. Um, and I guess when we're looking at this, you're probably looking at, is this indoor versus outdoor access or, other hazards that are in the area. I guess what are at the high level, what are the top checklist items that, people need to be bringing to the table to make sure that they're um, going to assist you in getting this HMA put together?
Yeah, so for the site specific HMAs, I mean, the first thing we look for is we look at the product. So again, hopefully there's been a product level HMA. If there hasn't been, that can be overcome. It's just a heck of a lot more work, more communication, more digging, and it's going to be slower. And hopefully the product has been designed properly. So for the specific site, I mean, obviously we're looking at all the different setbacks, which are in 855, spacing between enclosures, water supply, access, all the site specific things, which we know the AHJ will also be looking for, because ultimately, as somebody who writes HMAs, I'm not just writing this for other FPs. I'm actually, in fact, my goal is to write a document that the AHJ will approve. So, um, I want, and having been an AHJ, I want to make sure everything complies. So that's actually my goal is to write something that the AHJ will have as few comments on as possible. And in doing so, all those pain points need to be addressed. The AHJ might not want to get into the weeds about the liquid cooling system or the BMS, but they sure are going to want to look at access, water supply, separation distances, large scale fire testing. It's really the gamut is what goes into these if they're done properly.
And one of the things that we had when we talked about this in our prep calls, was characterizing the failure modes. And so, can you kind of touch on what that looks like? When we talk about failure modes, there's probably maybe some obvious ones, but maybe there's some others that need to characterize or need to be considering during this HMA process.
Yeah, so the first failure we'll consider is just thermal runaway, right? Let's just assume everything has failed and thermal runaway occurs, and then so we'll look at what are the measures in place to prevent that, which, could be the battery management system, the listings are good, could be the cooling system, there's a number of layers. And then, if that thermal runaway occurs, what mechanisms do we have in place to reduce the consequences? So, is there a deflagration venting system? Is there a combustible concentration reduction system? How far are you away from exposures? Things like that. So then what you do is you kind of get in. This is where the product level review is very important. So you do need to get into, okay, well, what happens if the liquid cooling system fails? What measures do we still have in place that are potentially not impacted by that failure? So sometimes people do layers of protection analysis. So, are there multiple failures stemming from a single failure? We'll look at if the battery management system fails, what might happen? If the explosion control systems fail, what might happen? So these are all kind of described in NFPA 855 as things you are supposed to look at, but you would go basically failure by failure and assess what are the things that can prevent that failure from happening and what do you have in place to mitigate any consequences if that particular system fails.
Perfect. Yeah, and so I think that that's something that we're obviously concerned about and think people are thinking about. And one of the questions that actually came in prior was James Nagel sent this question in asking about where the question is, where do you most often see failures in energy storage systems? And the pretext of that is, if we're putting these hazard mitigation analysis together, it's helpful to understand past failure when we're looking at what these others are. And I would love to hear from I know that there's been some incidents in San Diego. I don't know how much you can or cannot say, Matt. Some of them may be, still undergoing investigation or something, but there's been some incidents that happened in New York, for example. There are some reports out there where it was water intrusion from rain or others things coming into the cabinet. So it was the mechanical system that was the point of failure that then led to the energy storage system. So Nick, you had mentioned thermal runaway, but that wasn't the cause of the failure, wasn't what instigated the failure. So I'm just curious if just at a high level, kind of if you guys can talk about, where you've seen the failures in energy storage systems. I know there are not a ton of them out there, but there have been some.
I guess I'll go first, and I'll just speak very generally. When we see failure in BESS, the first one you already mentioned, water intrusion. The second one would be uh, maybe someone does something that they shouldn't have, maybe doing an operation or maintenance. You will call that human error. And then the third way that we see it is trauma to the batteries. And with a BESS, generally with us, that would imply like some kind of like a vehicle striking the BESS. So that's why with
Hmm.
us, like, when you come in for, I know we're talking about HMAs today, but like part of the review, I also look at the plans for a BESS and 314, which is the standard for vehicle impact protection, would be uh, it's going to be
Perfect.
strictly enforced.
Yes, sure. I like that trauma to the batteries. I hadn't heard
Yeah.
it put that way before.
Yeah, I think if you tie the the failure you were talking about, which is water intrusion. I mean, it's happened with sprinkler systems inside of enclosures. It's happened from improperly sealed penetrations, liquid coolant system failures, all those, creating a short somehow. Um, in an HMA, I think that's often overlooked, right? And if it's one of the main failure mechanisms, I mean, what do we usually have in place? Like we may have an IP55 rating on the enclosure, we may have an IP67 rating on the modules, but the maintenance, the design and the maintenance of the and the testing of the systems that have either coolant or water in them, I think that's often overlooked, and that kind of transitions into operations. So, if you just set it and forget it and you don't maintain those systems, which is required probably by your mechanical codes, but also 855, you're bound to have failures, from unexpected sources that are preventable.
Sure. Perfect. Great. Well, thanks for that. I know it's a interesting topic but it plays right into the whole HMA and, like what is it? What are we seeing? And what those hazards are and how are we going to address those? Okay. I did want to talk, we asked a question about when HMAs are required. And then, so we do have this language here, and I want to note this is the 2026 NFPA 855, so relatively new document at this point. And 855 is the standard for installation of our energy storage systems. We've referenced back to 1207 a lot. Matt's given us some very direct references within 1207. That's very often the code that's going to be really requiring what our what our installations how we're installing these, how we're permitting these. Um, IFC and International Fire Code, IFC and 855 have, I would call it, a symbiotic relationship. They're referencing each other. There's a lot of references in IFC straight to 855. They're not on the same cycle as in terms of being updated though. So we do have a little bit of a not a disconnect, but we do have a little bit of a lag and a difference there. So those two are working together as much as possible. But what I did want to just point out here, and Nick, this was something that in our prep call, something that you had kind of brought to the forefront for me is in the IFC, in the current IFC, which is the 2024 IFC, there are references to hazard mitigation analysis when we exceed 600 kilowatt hours of lithium ion technology. And that's further reinforced in the 2023 855. In 2026, kind of as you see there at the bottom there, the upshot is that table in 2026 has been removed. And so, Nick, would you mind just kind of walking us through or talking about that and kind of the intention of that and what that result is in terms of HMAs, the requirements uh, with respect to the amount of energy storage we have on individual sites?
Yeah, sure. So the 2023 NFP 855 had a maximum allowable quantity trigger threshold of 600 kilowatt hours, which was a relatively arbitrary number, in fact. And I don't represent the NFPA technical committee, but from the discussions that occurred, I think it was understood that you can have a serious incident in an energy storage system that's 598 kilowatt hours. You can have a very significant explosion. You could have multiple commercial industrial units next to each other with might result in a significant fire. And so the 600 kilowatt hour was essentially in there. The only reason it was in there was to require an HMA and also to require an emergency response plan. And so, because bad things can happen in less than 600 kilowatt hours, basically the committee got rid of that and just said for all installations, you should do an HMA and an ERP. So that's kind of how that evolved.
Got it. Yeah, and so I think it's just a good thing for people to be aware of in terms of kind of the question, very early came up, how often are jurisdictions requiring it? And we're seeing the changes in the codes and the standards to being much more stringent about it and requiring these. So I think that's just something as an industry we should be aware of, ready for, and planning for in our designs, in our installations. Um, this question came in, I think, as we were talking about this. I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Matt, you had mentioned the vehicle impact, which, again, not necessarily on this, but it's an interesting question nonetheless. 1207 in IFC requires these bollards or requires vehicular protection. Doesn't say bollards specifically, but I think that's probably the default for a lot of people. And then we have NEC that has some requirements for re space about equipment, serviceability, and things like that. So um, I guess the question is, how do we marry the fact that we need these bollards or we need protection, but we also need to be able to service the equipment. So I'm not sure, Matt, if you have an answer on the IFC perspective. One of the things that I've seen are removable bollards. I don't know if that's something that's been is an acceptable thing in the eyes of IFC or in your opinion, or if they're strong enough. That's one that I have seen employed. Another one is just physically separating the bollard from the energy source, so you electrically you're meeting the codes to be able to do the service work in the future.
Sure. You basically answered the question the
Okay,
same way I would have. 1207, calls for vehicle impact protection and it references, I don't have the code in front of me, but it will
sure, that's fine.
reference 314. 314 basically has, hey, you need to have, I think it's 4, 6, 8-inch bollards. They need to be set, I think it's 3 feet into cement. Basically, what it's saying is you can't use bolted in bollards,
Okay,
which I'll tell you for my HJ is an absolute no-go. But we do allow removable bollards, which is
okay.
the we understand like, hey, there's going to be, you're setting yourself up to be able to do heavy maintenance and stuff like that. Absolutely. You can
Perfect.
utilize removable bollards.
Perfect. Yeah. Again, wasn't exactly what we're here to talk about, but still good information nonetheless.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're at 10 of the hour, so I'm gonna jump into some talking about training. This is something that came up in our prep calls. It's actually part of 855, talks about how the owner is required to provide this training for different parties, different the installers need to be trained. We need to have those doing O&M, and we actually have requirements for training around first responders. And one of the questions that came in beforehand was, can you give us a source of some ways of training those first responders? And so, Matt, and I'm sure Nick, you'll have some input here as well. I'm going to pull up the code, the NFPA language here, just to with some circles, just to drive the point home a little bit. But there is a training aspect to this, and I'm curious, Matt, as a AHJ, as the fire official, is this how are you seeing this being implemented? Is this something that you are able to kind of drive and require? Are you relying on the EPCs or the developers to be running this and providing the plans for you? Just you'd mentioned all of the great things that the first responders have access to. How are you guys training people? I guess is the bottom line question.
Sure. Kind of the short answer is it all starts back at your HMA. You've done your HMA to help us, me, a non-fire protection engineer, identify unique hazards to this BESS. We've then used that HMA to fill out our emergency response plan, our commissioning and our decommissioning plan. And I'd like to emphasize these documents are as much for the end user as they are for me. These are for the end user to think through, hey, these different scenarios. And like, I tell people this is even for as simple as like the thing appears to be malfunctioning or it's making a funny noise. Who do they call? What's their phone number for their tech support? So, and then to all kind of use an example, we recently had a large BESS put in within the city of San Diego, and I worked with that end user, the eventual operator of that site, to not only have uh, local engine crews from both my agency and a nearby agency. They did the site familiarization that we talked to. That was provided by the operator. And again, that was just, it's great for these crews to have familiarity with this site, but before they even enter it. And then not only that, but it's me making sure that our dispatch notes, that document that I talked about is in there, including their emergency contacts. Because one of the first things that we would do as an agency, if we have an incident at one of these sites, is we're going to get in touch with you, especially if this is, at after hours kind of a thing. And then kind of the last part of that is where I come in is a lot of times I will provide training to our department based on that HMA, that emergency response plan for some kind of unique hazards to this site, which I have had. And it's just, again, it's a crew awareness for our operations personnel. Again, they have their standard operating procedure on how we would operate at a lithium ion battery incident. That's everything from like a scooter to a car to a large energy storage site, and how would we operate at each one of those. But again, it's very helpful to the crews if there are unique challenges, and the more information they have before potential incident, the smoother that incident is going to run. So did I answer the question there?
Yeah, no, that's great. It's and I think that, as I mentioned, I think San Diego is probably on the forefront of a lot of this, and so there's a lot of jurisdictions that probably don't have the same level of resources and be able to do this. So it's just great to hear what you are doing in ways that others can hopefully model. Other AHJs, that is,
And
can
and
model.
sorry, and I was going to say maybe one part of it that I left out is, in the permitting process that we do before giving an operational permit, as we would under 104, it's everything. It's, hey, do you have your Knox box installed? Are your Knox box keys compatible with ours? Is your signage up to date? Is your emergency contact work? All those little things that we're trying to set the public and your operators up for safety and set up our personnel for a smooth operation should they be needed.
Hey,
Perfect.
I just wanted to add one thing to that.
Please.
So it's not just the fire department. Of course, they're the primary customers of this emergency response plan. But the 2026 855 actually has a new section on facility staff training. So, I feel like for grid scale, there's usually an operator. It's usually a pretty well-defined operation, and all the people who need to be involved in an incident are hopefully going to be involved. But when you get to like a Target or a Walmart or a school, you get to a situation where there's a lot of other people that might need to be involved in some way that, if they don't know anything about this battery, like the maintenance guy at Walmart, he should, you need these contacts at a minimum. Those contacts need to be familiar with the battery. They at least need to maybe know, can we access the battery management system? Who do we call? Like, can we call the manufacturers? Their 24/7 line. It's not just the fire department. So I think we should stress that other people should attend this training as well.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some language here in my notes that talk about exactly that. And so, and there's refresh, the 855 goes into, annual refresher training, and that you need to notify the emergency responders about that. And I think in one of the early calls too that we had, it was pointed out that, like you just said, Nick, the fire department is a primary recipient of all this, but they may not be the only first responders. There might be other emergency responders out there that need to be in the know on this. And so this is becomes quite a task in order to do this. And I really like that you mentioned other places like schools, for example, where talk about resource strapped. This goes in and that's great, but making sure that the right people are educated and trained and continually do so is an important aspect that I think is we need to make sure that we're taking seriously within the industry. All right, well, we're getting really close to the top of the hour. I'm going to pull these up key takeaways. There were a couple questions. First one's super easy. I think there was a reference to 314, Matt. I believe is that IFC? You're just referring to a section in section 314.
It's 314 or it's 312 of the California Fire Code.
California Fire Code.
It's
Okay.
vehicle impact protection.
Okay. Perfect. That was I perfect. I knew that was the easy one. Um, Quick question. I'll try and keep this one quick. But non-lithium products. Are you guys seeing like non-lithium products? And the question is about easier permitting for non-lithium products. Personally, I've seen probably exactly one non-lithium energy storage project go in the last number of years. So I'm just curious if that's even something that is coming across your guys' desk.
I still see lead acid batteries,
You do. Okay.
lead acid, but they come in for very specific industrial site.
Okay. Okay. So a
Yeah,
little bit different application and maybe not quite the same level or the same requirements.
What about you, Nick?
yeah. I mean, I've seen like nickel zinc, some flow batteries, not so much sodium ion. A lot of these technologies are out there. They're just the commercialization is a little bit less. So some of them actually are safer, and then some of the claims that they're safer are likely need to be validated a bit more. Um, so, when we really get into 855, if you're doing like an HMA for an indoor installation, this type of conversation becomes really important because you can, if they're willing to entertain other technologies, you can justify an indoor energy storage system a lot better if you use some sort of technology that doesn't go into thermal runaway. So,
Okay. Perfect. Okay, well, we're right at the top of the hour. So, um, thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. I just want to remind folks, there's lots of online courses. We encourage you to look at our website and take a look at courses that we have, both, asynchronous and synchronous classes. And then I also wanted to make sure that we land here, have our contact info. If you have questions for us about this topic specifically, you can reach out to us. My info is right there. If there's other topics you'd love to hear about, let us know. Matt and Nick, thank you so much. Your time, I know, is very, very valuable, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to prepare and then spend some time here with us today. It's been great, and as I imagine, we're plenty more to talk about, but I appreciate you.
Thank you for your time and the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.